Okay, so someone sent us this fictional podcast from 2030, How the U.S. Lost the Ukraine, a 2030 reckoning. And get this, the host is explaining to his granddaughter how Chinese ships ended up patrolling the Atlantic.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a pretty chilling image, right? Like a weird future history lesson. And honestly, some of it hits a little too close for comfort.
It is fascinating, though, to sort of look at a fictional account like this, almost like a thought experiment,
Hmm.
like warning us about um, potential pitfalls in U.S. foreign policy.
Right. And the term Empire of Liberty comes up, which has always been a loaded way to describe America's role in the world.
For sure.
But this David Lipton character, he really leans into it. He lays out these three pillars of U.S. strategic interests that he says have been rock solid since 1945.
And what's striking is how consistent these pillars are, regardless of whether Democrats or Republicans were in charge.
Exactly.
It's like a fundamental blueprint for how America sees itself in the world.
Okay, so pillar one is all about keeping those sea lanes open for trade. Classic maritime empire stuff, right?
Exactly. Control the oceans, control the world.
Yeah, very classic stuff.
It makes sense when you consider America's geography. I mean, it's a continental island nation, so its trade routes are its lifelines.
Right.
If you can't protect those routes, your economy and influence take a major hit.
Makes sense. Then there's pillar two, preventing any other power or group from messing with U.S. influence and alliances around the globe. Basically, staying on top no matter what.
Which leads us to pillar three, the incentive game. It's about making sure it's more appealing for other countries to work with the U.S. than against it. Carrots and sticks, but hopefully more carrots.
Right. Sounds straightforward enough, but Lipton goes on to paint a pretty bleak picture of how things actually went down. He uses these two world maps as a visual aid, though obviously we can't see them in the audio. In the year 2000, the U.S. is this dominant blue force on the map, the major trading partner for most of the globe. But by 2024, things look totally different.
Yet China, represented in red, has taken over massive chunks of that trade influence, particularly in the Eastern Hemisphere. It's like someone flipped the script, and you can't help but wonder, how did this happen? What went so wrong in those 24 years?
Well, according to Lipton, the U.S. basically made a series of major blunders. Almost like they were playing checkers while rivals like Russia and China were playing a strategic game of chess.
He doesn't sugarcoat it. Yeah. He straight up says the U.S. came across as fickle and unreliable on the world stage, bouncing between wanting to be the global savior and then retreating inward whenever things got tough.
He uses this phrase, chronic indignation, versus the cosmic feeling to describe it.
Oh, interesting.
Like America's constantly swinging between being outraged by world events and then feeling this almost messianic duty to fix everything.
Right, like a superhero complex, but without the follow-through. And Lipton argues that this inconsistency ultimately undermined America's credibility.
Makes sense. If you keep flip-flopping on your commitments, why would anyone trust you as a reliable partner? And he uses some pretty heavy historical examples to drive this point home, starting with Woodrow Wilson's 14 points after World War I.
Yeah, of course.
Remember, Wilson was hailed as this visionary leader who wanted to create a lasting peace. But then
The U.S. Senate rejects the Treaty of Versailles, which included Wilson's vision for a League of Nations. Imagine being part of the international community at that time. Talk about whiplash.
Exactly. One minute, America's leading the charge for global cooperation. The next minute, they're pulling back.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
And it's not like this was just an isolated incident.
Right.
Lipton brings up the period from Pearl Harbor to 1991, where you could argue U.S. engagement was more consistent, at least outwardly.
Right.
But then he throws Vietnam and Afghanistan into the mix, both of which were.
Costly, long-term engagements that ended in pretty hasty withdrawals.
Right, and these are tough events to analyze, even with hindsight.
Yeah.
But what message does that send to other countries who are counting on American support? If even your allies start to doubt your staying power, that's a problem.
And that's where Lipton's whole checkers versus chess analogy comes in. He argues that the U.S. got so fixated on short-term political gains and personalities, the checkers game, that they completely missed the bigger picture unfolding around them.
While rivals like Russia and China were playing the long game, making strategic moves, exploiting those inconsistencies in American foreign policy, and slowly building their own influence.
Yeah, it's pretty sobering when you think about it. Did America get so complacent in its own power that it failed to see these threats on the horizon? Lipton uses this powerful quote from Henry Kissinger. "We must have the ability and determination to act alone, or with a regional grouping of powers, if our strategic interest so dictates."
But how can you project that kind of decisive leadership if you're constantly flip-flopping on what those interests are. It's like sending mixed signals to everyone.
And these mixed signals, according to Lipton, led to some very real consequences. He points to 2028 as a turning point, when the U.S. Navy actually had to pull back to protect its own shores. I mean, wow, that's a huge shift from being the global police force, right?
Exactly. It left a vacuum that China was more than happy to fill. And remember your original question, why are Chinese ships patrolling the Atlantic in 2030? Well, this is Lipton's answer. America's inconsistency and short-sightedness created the conditions for its own decline.
It's like realizing your home security system only covers the front porch when someone's already sneaking in the back window.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
Too late. So if this fictional future is even remotely possible, and I think we can all agree that some of these trends are already playing out today, what can we learn from it? What are our blind spots?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Lipton focuses mainly on military and economic power. But I think there's another dimension that's crucial here, the power of ideas. What values does America genuinely stand for in the world today? Are those values even clear anymore? And are we effectively communicating them in a way that wins hearts and minds, not just battles?
That's a great question. And honestly, it's one that each of us needs to think about, not just policymakers or experts, because at the end of the day, the decisions we make today will shape the world of tomorrow. It's all connected, you know?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's what makes Lipton's fictional podcast so thought-provoking. It's not just a history lesson from the future. It's a call to action for all of us in the present.
Yeah, it really does make you question, like, are we playing the long game here?
Right. Are we so caught up in the day-to-day headlines that we're missing the bigger picture? Because Lipton keeps hammering on this point about American inconsistency on the world stage.
Yeah, he dives deeper into those historical examples. And one that really struck me was Woodrow Wilson and his famous 14 points after World War I.
Oh, yeah.
I remember learning about that in school. Wilson was hailed as this peacemaker, right? He
Yeah.
wanted to create a new world order based on cooperation and self-determination.
Exactly. And people were excited about it. The 14 points were seen as this blueprint for a more just and peaceful world. When Wilson arrived in Paris for the peace negotiations, he was practically treated like a rock star.
Oh, wow.
But then, what happened?
Yeah, what did happen?
Well, the U.S. Senate back home rejected the Treaty of Versailles, which included Wilson's vision for a League of Nations. Can you imagine the shock? It was a major setback for international cooperation, and according to Lipton, a classic example of America's ambivalence about engaging with the rest of the world.
It's like getting everyone hyped up for this big party and then deciding to stay home at the last minute. Talk about mixed messages.
Right. Yeah, totally. Lipton argues that this early example set a precedent for future flip-flops in American foreign policy. The U.S. would oscillate between periods of intense global involvement and then periods of retreating inward, almost like it couldn't decide what role it wanted to play.
So this lack of a consistent strategy is what ultimately led to the decline that Lipton describes.
Exactly. He then jumps ahead to the post-World War II era.
Mm-hmm.
From the late 1940s to the early 1990s, America was basically the undisputed leader of the free world, facing off against the Soviet Union in the Cold War.
Yes. The good old days of superpower rivalry. That was a time of consistent engagement, with America shaping the global order and, keeping the communists at bay.
Right, but even during this period, there were cracks starting to show. Lipton brings up the Vietnam War, which, as you know, was a costly and ultimately unsuccessful conflict that really divided American society.
Yeah, the images from that war are still so powerful, and the fact that America withdrew seemingly overnight after years of involvement must have been a huge blow to its credibility.
Exactly. It raised serious questions about whether America was truly committed to its allies, whether it had the stomach for a long fight, even if the cause was just...
Right. And then, of course, there's Afghanistan, which sadly seems to follow a similar pattern.
Another long-term military involvement that ended in a chaotic withdrawal, leaving many people questioning whether any lessons had been learned from Vietnam. These events make you wonder, did America overestimate its ability to shape outcomes in these complex situations?
Or did it underestimate the costs and the commitment required to see these interventions through to the end? Lipton seems to think that America's geographic isolation might have something to do with this tendency to disengage when things get tough.
It's interesting. He calls the U.S. a continental island, protected by these vast oceans on either side, which on the one hand gives a sense of security, but on the other can lead to a kind of detachment from what's happening in the rest of the world.
Almost like an out of sight, out of mind mentality.
Right. But the problem is, in the 21st century, those oceans aren't the barriers they used to be. Technology, trade, information, everything moves so fast now that that distance doesn't matter as much.
Which means threats can pop up anywhere, regardless of where you're located.
Exactly. And that's why Lipton stresses the importance of proactive engagement, of maintaining strong alliances, and of, of consistently projecting American power around the world.
So it's not just about having the biggest military or the strongest economy. It's about being present, being reliable, and being willing to hold the line, as he puts it.
Yes, and not necessarily through military force alone, but through diplomacy, economic partnerships, and by genuinely standing up for those democratic values that America claims to champion.
Because in this hyper-connected world, perception matters, right? If America is seen as weak, inconsistent, or unreliable, other powers will be happy to step into that leadership vacuum.
It's almost like America has to constantly prove itself,
Yeah.
Reaffirm its commitment, not just to its allies, but to the idea of global leadership.
And Lipton doesn't shy away from calling out specific rivals who he thinks are taking advantage of this situation.
He names Russia and China as having strategically exploited America's weaknesses. They saw these inconsistencies as opportunities to build their own influence and wait for the right moment to assert themselves.
While America was busy with internal debates and short-term thinking, these other powers were playing the long game patiently and strategically.
Lipton highlights a quote from Kissinger again, which I think is relevant here. The statesman must choose between the desirable and the possible. He seems to be saying that America often gets caught up in what it wants to do in the world instead of what it realistically can do.
It's like the difference between having ideals and actually having a strategy to make those ideals a reality.
Right. And Lipton argues that this gap between rhetoric and action is something that America's rivals have been very good at exploiting.
So if we're connecting this back to our original question about Chinese ships in the Atlantic, it sounds like Lipton is saying that those ships are a symptom of a much deeper problem. It's not just about military might. It's about a failure of leadership, a failure of vision.
Yes, and perhaps a failure of imagination. It's like America couldn't or wouldn't imagine a world where it wasn't the dominant power. And that lack of imagination made it vulnerable to these shifting tides of global power.
Yeah, it's like we need a wake-up call.
Yeah.
A reminder that America's role in the world isn't a given.
I mean, Lipton definitely sees his podcast as a warning from the future.
Right. But he also points out that that it's not too late to change course.
He still thinks America has the potential to be, a force for good, but only if you can shake off this complacency and adopt a more strategic approach to foreign policy.
So where do we even begin? It all feels so overwhelming. Like, what can any one of us actually do about these huge geopolitical shifts?
I think Lipton would say it starts with understanding the problem.
Yeah.
He keeps coming back to this idea that America needs to be more clear-eyed about its own strengths and weaknesses, as well as, the motivations of its rivals.
So less wishful thinking, more pragmatic analysis.
Exactly. He uses this analogy. He says, America has often acted like the rich kid who assumes they'll always win, even if they don't really know how to play the game.
Ouch. That's a harsh but kind of accurate comparison.
Right. And he contrasts this with the approach of countries like China, which he says are playing the long game, strategically building their influence and patiently waiting for the right moment to assert themselves.
It's like they've studied the rule book while America's been relying on, its natural talent,
Yeah.
which may not be enough anymore.
And he argues that America needs to be more consistent in its actions. He says words are cheap, actions speak louder. It's not enough to simply talk about freedom and democracy. You have to actually support those values in a tangible way.
So back up your rhetoric with concrete action. Like, what kind of action are we talking about here?
Well, Lipton gives a few examples. He talks about the importance of rebuilding alliances that have been frayed in recent years. He stresses the need for clear communication, both with allies and adversaries, to avoid misunderstandings and miscalculations.
Right. It's like being a good poker player. You have to know when to hold them, know when to fold them, and never let your opponents see your cards.
Exactly. And he also emphasizes the need for a strong military, not for the sake of aggression, but to deter potential adversaries and to be prepared to defend American interests if necessary.
So basically, be ready to walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
Precisely. Lipton argues that America needs to project an image of strength and resolve, not just through its military might, but through its economic power, its diplomatic skills, and its unwavering commitment to its values.
He also brings up this idea of material interests trumping stated positions, especially when it comes to America's rivals.
Right. He argues that while America often gets bogged down in debates about values and principles, its adversaries are laser-focused on achieving their own tangible goals: power, influence, and resources. They're playing to win, not to make friends.
So maybe America needs to be more pragmatic in its dealings with these rivals. Less idealistic, more focused on concrete outcomes.
He uses the example of China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is this massive global infrastructure project, expanding China's economic and political influence across Asia, Africa, and Europe.
Yeah, I've heard about that. It's like China's version of the Marshall Plan, right?
Sure.
But on a much grander scale.
Exactly. Lipton argues that while America was busy debating the pros and cons of globalization, China went ahead and started building its own global network. It's like they saw an opportunity and seized it while America was stuck in, analysis paralysis.
So what's the takeaway for us here? Should we be more worried about China's rise?
I think Lipton's point is not necessarily to fear China, but to understand China, to recognize that it's a major player on the world stage with its own interests and ambitions, and to develop a strategy that takes those interests into account.
Okay, yeah. He also talks about how America's tendency to focus on personalities rather than patterns has blinded it to the true nature of its rival strategies.
Right. Like he points out that we often get caught up in the personalities of individual leaders, whether it's Putin, Xi Jinping, or whoever the latest villain might be. But this focus on individuals can distract us from the bigger picture.
It's like we're obsessed with the actors, but we've forgotten about the play itself.
Exactly. For example, Lipton argues that Russia's actions in Ukraine aren't just about Putin's personal ambitions. They're part of a long-standing pattern of Russian behavior, this desire to expand its territory and influence at the expense of its neighbors.
So it's less about who's in charge and more about the historical forces at play.
Right. And Lipton argues that the same is true for China. Their actions in the South China Sea, for instance, aren't simply a reflection of Xi Jinping's assertiveness. They're part of a long-term Chinese strategy to establish dominance in that region.
So by focusing on personalities, we risk missing the forest for the trees.
Exactly. He suggests that America needs to develop a more sophisticated understanding of its rivals, one that takes into account their history, their culture, and their long-term objectives. We need to understand their game plan if we want to counter it effectively.
He also brings up America's history of supporting democratic movements around the world, but in recent years, he says this commitment has wavered, and it's making people question whether America still believes in its own ideals.
Yeah, that's a really important point. Lipton argues that if America wants to maintain its credibility and influence, it needs to reaffirm its commitment to those ideals, both at home and abroad.
So walk the walk, not just talk the talk, right?
Exactly. He believes that America's strength ultimately lies not in its military or economic power, but in the power of its ideas. The ideals of freedom, democracy, and human rights have always been a source of inspiration for people around the world.
Right. So if America wants to reclaim its role as a global leader, it needs to start living up to those ideals in a more consistent and meaningful way.
And that's the challenge he leaves us with. It's a call to action, a reminder that the future is not predetermined.
This deep dive has been a real eye-opener. It's made me think about America's role in the world in a whole new light.
Me too. Lipton's fictional podcast, even though it's set in the future, has a lot to teach us about the present. It's a reminder that we can't afford to be complacent.
We need to be engaged, we need to be strategic, and we need to be willing to stand up for the values that we believe in.
Because the world is watching, and the stakes are high.
So let's learn from Lipton's warning, embrace the challenge, and work together to build a future where America remains a force for good in the world.
A future where those Chinese ships never make it to the Atlantic.
That's a future worth fighting for. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's giving you some food for thought and maybe even inspired you to take action. Remember, the future is not set in stone. It's up to each of us to shape it.